I think Putin is a cold calculator. I think his KGB training has stood him in exceptionally good stead. I think he's not afraid to flex the power that he has, even within his own private circle. I think he has approached strategy in a way that we didn't quite understand in the West. I think nobody thought that Russia actually would invade Ukraine on the scale that they have. It caught out almost every academic I know who specialises in Russia. The fact that he is committed to this lengthy war of attrition, I don't think people saw the Russians having the will and the determination to see that through either. So I think Putin he thinks long term, he thinks strategically over time, and I think he thinks in a way that we in the West have not especially well understood over the last few years. The initial assault was just exceptionally poor planning. A great example of that is the Hostomel Airport's airborne raid, where they essentially just flew planes in and tried to drop paratroopers. The way that we would do it, there would be a combined air operation, there would be suppression of enemy air defences, and only once the target area was cleared would you then come in and drop paratroopers. Whereas they just jumped straight to that end phase of the operation. So they just planned it and executed it really badly. And the Ukrainian anti-tank training that they've been given was incredibly effective. The Javelin is a brilliant weapon, and it showed its value in those first 3 days. And I think we're continuing to see poor operational planning from the Russians, with Kharkiv being a really good example of that. They've literally just thrown bodies at the problem. Platoon after platoon after platoon just thrown against the Ukrainian lines, designed to get them just to use up their ammunition, with no regards to tactics or manoeuvre. But what they do have is a huge amount of personnel that they can keep throwing at Ukrainian lines. And that's why it's so important that we keep supplying Ukraine, because Russia's entire strategy seems designed around making them use up their ammunition. And that's why it's taking as long as it is. The Russian strategy is clear. They're looking at putting pressure on the Ukrainian lines, making them spread their reserve thinly so that if there is a breakthrough, they're not in a position to respond. The Ukrainians are clearly fighting a brave defensive battle, which has been successful, particularly in the Kharkiv offensive, which just last week the Americans were happy to say they were confident had now stalled and wouldn't make any further progress. And as I understand it, they've only made 5 miles of progress along 2 axes over the entire offensive, which is, for the cost of lives and materiel they've expended on that, is a really poor result for Russia. I think the ability to strike targets now in part of Russia's rear area will be important, because they now have to defend their rear areas as well as defend their assets on the front lines, and that's going to put pressure on the Russian side of production and keeping their assets safe. But I think Ukraine need to make sure they can keep recruiting. I understand that is a problem for them. They're going to need the numbers, because it's a war of attrition, and it's ultimately going to come down to who can afford to take the most losses. I think Putin has set enough red lines that have been surpassed that we can attribute a degree of bluster to what he's saying. The most recent one was if Ukraine were allowed to strike into Russian rear areas with American weapons. Medvedev said that Russia would respond by arming America's opponents in unspecified countries. It all seems a bit weak to me. Escalation goes both ways. Russia still have as much to lose from a nuclear war as we do. And given the state of the Russian military, I would have concerns about the state of their nuclear arsenal as well. I think a shooting match of a nuclear kind is not something Russia want to be considering, because I suspect they would be deeply overmatched. America is still indisputably the world's only military superpower, and taking NATO on militarily means taking on the USA. And I don't think even Putin is that stupid. So he can make as many red lines as he likes, but there is a limit to the amount he can reasonably escalate matters without it being catastrophic for Russia. I think there'll always be an inherent tension between Russia and China. They're ultimately fighting for influence and strategic competition in the same space. So it's a friendship of convenience, I suggest. The Iranian-Russian relationship is a lot more solidified. Iran are producing weapons, drones and ammunition for Russia in the fight in Ukraine. But we are seeing an era of unprecedented strategic tension. In the 1990s, we assumed that it was the end of history and that liberal democracies would flourish and globalism and capitalism would see the world come to peace. And that has absolutely not paid out. We took our eyes off the ball between 2003 and 2021 as we were invading various countries in the world to fight counterinsurgency campaigns there. And in that time, our enemies have been planning and buying influence. If you look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, they're dominating influence around the world. Russia has been conducting operations in Georgia, Ukraine in 2014, and then Ukraine again in the recent invasion. They're looking to establish their power and influence over their near abroad, and Iran is looking at hegemony in the Middle East. So this era of strategic competition is very much us against them, but there is also a bit of strategic friction between them. They're allies of convenience, not allies of will or intent. It's been a key component part of Russia's strategy to degrade Western will to fight. They are actively targeting our media, they're actively targeting our politicians, and the flow of disinformation, you still see it repeated constantly. Things like Ukrainian Nazis and the Azov battalions and all that nonsense. People credibly believe it. It's a very, very powerful thing. And it's absolutely something that Russia are going to keep trying doing. Israel-Gaza is showing us the power of disinformation as we speak. There's so much incorrect information flowing about that conflict. And of course, it's all part of the same axis. Iran, Russia, China, they're all on the same team effectively. And they all use the same subversive techniques to try and undermine Western democracies using our own freedom of speech against us. This wouldn't work in Russia or China or Iran because they don't allow that free passage of information. They've taken what we see as one of our strengths, the fact that people are free to say what they want, and they're using it against us. So I think we can absolutely count on this sea of subversive disinformation being a factor that we have to include in all planning, strategically and politically, from now on and into the future. I mean, maintenance of morale is a principle of war that the British Army teaches from the first week of officer training. Our entire doctrine when we fight is designed at shattering the enemy's will and cohesion. So the benefits of morale and the importance of morale can't really be understated. And it's only natural in a war of severe attrition that morale is going to take a hit. If you're seeing your friends dying on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, that is going to hurt your morale. And especially as Ukraine doesn't have a huge number of wins to chalk up at the moment. Hopefully the stalling of the Kharkiv offensive will give the Ukrainian armed forces that boost of effectively a really good win against the Russians. But it's this grinding war of attrition, and the nearest thing we can compare it to is the First World War, where anyone who served in the trenches and wrote a memoir afterwards spoke about how miserable it was, the living conditions, the constant artillery barrages. It will naturally degrade soldiers. So that's a real challenge. But we're in a war of will now. So Ukraine have to make sure that their cohesion and will to fight is maintained. I think it's been a shame that we weren't able to give Ukraine everything they needed right at the start. I think that the drip feed of Western support has definitely caused them operational issues. But I think it's just vital that we in the West double down, increase our arms production, get what we can to Ukraine, and of course start building up our own stocks. For any potential future Russian threat, that's going to need to be something we're very alive to, and that we haven't been recently, and need to get a grip of. The British Army has trained thousands of Ukrainians. There's been an enormous commitment from the UK towards Ukraine. I don't see really what more we could have done with what we had at the time. Pretty much every bit of spare stock we've got has gone east. But it does highlight how under-equipped and under-prepared the British Army is. I have genuine concerns about the last defence review, which I think cut into the bone, not down to the bone, into the bone. The army is burning red hot at the moment. We've got people spread all around the world delivering training missions, and yet we don't have a properly deployable full armoured division that we could deploy into Europe in short notice should we need to, and that to me is deeply concerning. So I think there's a lot of work needs doing for whoever's in Parliament after the next general election. Defence is an urgent need to fix, and 2.5% won't cut it. President Biden is fighting a domestic battle on a couple of fronts, as well as trying to properly support Ukraine. It's a really tricky line for him. We're seeing that with his stance on Israel, how he's having to placate his own voters, and we're seeing the troubles he's had in Congress trying to get the aid packages through for Ukraine. So, his cautiousness, I think, is a result of the political limitations that are placed on him by his own legislature. Also, escalation is a game that we have to play carefully with. We can't just throw, American weapons into Russia to the maximum extent, because that is a huge escalatory step that might well see a Russian escalation in response that is within their bounds. So there is still a very fine line to tread here. There's still a place for diplomacy. And there's still a place to make sure that Ukraine can do what they need to do without trying to overstep any lines that Russia might actually decide they want to enforce.